Kesubos Daf Daled begins in the middle of a very complex, multi-layered discussion about Kamli B'Dirami Minei. We will go through the layers of the discussion that the Gemara presents. The Gemara starts deep in, and then the Gemara takes a step back to offer alternatives to what we said before, and then another step back. So we will give context for each step back as we get to it. So let's begin. The Gemara is discussing the concept of Maisa Shabbos, which means if somebody was Machal Shabbos, we'll talk about the case of somebody cooks food on Shabbos. So the question is he allowed to use and benefit from that which he created through his Chil Shabbos? So would he be allowed to use the food that he cooked on Shabbos? So the variable is, are we talking about where he cooked b'shogeg chol Shabbos or b'mezid? Did he do it on purpose or did he do it by mistake? We'll have three opinions of Tanaim for each one of those, and the variables are possibly he's allowed to eat it, or possibly he's only allowed to eat it after Shabbos, or possibly only other people are allowed to eat it, or possibly no one's allowed to eat it, either after Shabbos or forever. So let's go through the three opinions. So opinion number one is Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says if he cooked b'shogeg mutter, fine, he could use it himself, no problem, even on Shabbos. If he cooks b'mezid, then it's usher for him forever, but other Jews are allowed to enjoy it right away. That's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Huda is one step stricter in shogeg. He says if it's b'shogeg, he can't eat it right away. He can only eat it after Shabbos. But he agrees that if it's b'mezid, he cannot eat it forever. Other people are allowed to enjoy it right away. Now, Rabbi Yochanan the Sandler, who's the main opinion we're going to focus on as far as our discussion of Chamli B'Ramine, Rabbi Yochanan the Sandler says one level stricter. If it's b'shogeg, not only is he not allowed to eat it, and not only is he not allowed to eat it after Shabbos, he's not allowed to eat it at all. Only other people are allowed to eat it, and only after Shabbos. That is the most strict approach. If it's b'mezid, no one's allowed to eat it at any point, not him and not anybody else. The only thing he can do with it is sell it to a guy. Now, that's Rabbi Yochanan Sandler's opinion. The Gemara says, what is Pshat in Rabbi Yochanan Sandler? Why is it that he holds that this Maisa Shabbos is usher for everybody if it was done b'mezid? So the Gemara says that Rav Chia said a pshat on it at the entrance to the Veinasiya. It's based off of the pasuk that says Ushmartem Maisa Shabbos ki kodesh hi lachem. We're calling Shabbos holy. We're calling it kodesh, comparing it to hekdesh. Just like kodesh is usher, no one's allowed to eat it. Hekdesh, it belongs to Mammon Gavoa, no one is allowed to eat it. So something which is created on Shabbos also becomes kodesh, also becomes a status of being forbidden for anyone to eat at all. Now, you may therefore think that it's usher b'hana Maisa Shabbos, just like hekdesh is usher b'hana. So for that it says lochem, it says it's still to you. Hekdesh is not to you, this is still to you. So you're allowed to have hana, but you're not allowed to actually eat it forever. Now, the fact that it's only if it's b'mezid like that is learned by the fact that it says machal aleha mos yumas, the next phrase, and that's only referring to something which is b'mezid, where you could say there is the death penalty for being machal Shabbos. B'shogeg you wouldn't. So we're only talking about b'shogeg. We're only talking about b'mezid, not b'shogeg. B'mezid has an iser achila, but no iser hana, but that is forever. Now, the Gemara is in Machlokes Amraim whether this is all deraisa or it's derabanan and those are just a smachta. So Gemara says that it's Machlokes between Rav Acha and Ravina. We don't know which one's which. One says deraisa, one says derabanan. Now, how does this apply to us? So the Gemara is referring to a situation in which someone stole an animal, either a sheep or a cow, and he went ahead and slaughtered it. So generally, he would have to pay 4 times the value of a sheep and 5 times the value of the cow. Here, though, it was a situation where the shechita caused a iser that carries the death penalty, such as that it was avodah zarah, or it was chol Shabbos, or it was a shar niskal, it was a ox which is due to be stoned because it killed somebody. So the question had been, what is pshat in the machlokes about whether or not, besides for the fact that the person who did the shechita gets the death penalty for that, does he also have to pay a knas and the tashlumin, the 4 times and the 5 times the value of the animal that he stole? So that had been a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. The Chachamim had said he does not have to pay. The Gemara had said that Rabbi Meir said that he has to pay, and the reason is, the Gemara said, because he didn't do the shechita. Really, he holds of kamli b'ramine, but he had the shechita be performed through someone else. There's a sakasa that even though he didn't do it because he sent somebody to do it, he is responsible to pay the extra as if he had done it, but he doesn't get misa. Now, the Gemara Gemara says, though, what is pshat in the Rabbanan? Why do the Rabbanan say that he's pater and he does not have to pay the 4 and the 5 times? If someone else did the shechita, how could they possibly say that he doesn't have to pay? There's no kamei b'ramine. So the Gemara says the reason that he's pater is not because of kamei b'ramine. The Gemara says the reason is because just like Ma'aser Shabbos, it's a shechita she'eina ruya. The shechita doesn't count. It's a pasul shechita. So the Gemara asks, it's a pasul shechita. I understand shechita for avodah zarah is a pasul shechita. You can't eat the animal shechita for avodah zarah. I understand shechita v'shar niskal is a pasul shechita. You can't eat that. But the shechita that's done on Shabbos is a kosher shechita. We know that the halacha is that a shechita which is performed on Shabbos is kosher. There's nothing wrong with the shechita. The person is maybe machal Shabbos, or Yom Kippur is machal Yom Kippur. He'll get he'll get misa for it, but the shechita is a kosher shechita. You can't say it's not a kosher shechita. So Gemara answers that the Rabbanan here are holding like Rabbi Yochanan Sandler, who says that it's asur forever. A Ma'aser Shabbos is asur forever, and therefore you have no possibility of eating it, and therefore it's considered to be a shechita she'eina ruya. Even though a shechita is technically kosher, it's a shechita she'eina ruya because it's Ma'aser Shabbos, and therefore it doesn't count as a real shechita, and therefore they don't have to pay the 4 and the 5 times as much. Says the Gemara, we said there was a machlokes between Rav Acha and Ravina whether this din was deraisa or derabanan. The Gemara says if it's derabanan, so we're still stuck because that doesn't help me. How could I not have to pay the 4 and the 5? It's only midrabanan that you can't use it. Midaraisa is a perfectly kosher shechita and I can eat it. So Gemara says, okay, the one who holds it, it's the Rabbanan that you can't eat it. We'll have to say that when the Rabbanan were arguing, they weren't arguing about Shabbos. If you did it on Shabbos, it's a kosher shechita, you definitely would have to pay 4 and 5. It's only, they were talking about Shar Niska and Shar Avodah Zarah. There, you wouldn't have to pay the 4 and the 5. They didn't agree to that because those are pasul shechitas. Gemara now has 2 questions generally on the concept of kamei b'derami minei on a shar that's slaughtered for avodah zarah and a shar niskal. So we had said that Rabbi Meir's opinion is that if somebody steals an ox and he shechts it for avodah zarah or it's a shar niskal, he doesn't have to pay the knas of the 4 and the 5 because kamei b'derami, since he gets misa, he doesn't have to pay the fine and the monetary damages that are associated. So the first question is, first of all, when he shechted for avodah zarah, from the moment he starts the shechita, it already becomes an iser nevad. It already becomes an iser of tekrovas avodah zarah. So it's avodah zarah from that moment. That being the case, it's already iser hana, and it doesn't belong to anybody afterwards. So when he completes the shechita, which is when he should be obligated to pay the 4 and the 5, it's already not stolen. It's not the property of the owner anymore. It's already been destroyed and become valueless. So how does there ever any obligation that we can possibly consider that he should pay 4 and 5? The stealing never happens to any valued animal. So what is there to discuss over here? So Gemara answers, when he did the shechita, it's talking about where he did the shechita in such a way that he said that it shouldn't count as avoda until I finish the shechita. When I'm starting the shechita, it's not going to be avoda yet. Generally it is. If I don't say anything, it is. But here he's saying that avoda is going to be when I complete the shechita. Therefore, at the moment where he completes the shechita, he gets the obligation of paying 4 and 5, and he also is over an Isra avodah zarah at the same instant. Now, the Gemara is bothered by Shar Niskal. Shar Niskal is an animal that's also asur b'hana. It's valueless. So how is there any obligation for stealing and shechting the Shar HaNiskal? The time he did the shechita, there was no value. It didn't belong to the owner anymore. So the Gemara says there is one way that we could consider that it did belong to the owner and it had value, and that's as follows. Rabbi Meir must be holding like Rabbi Yaakov, who says that if he were to return, that if it's borrowed, we're referring to where the cow was borrowed from its owner and it was stolen. The cow was borrowed from its owner and then it killed somebody and it was taken to court and it was sentenced to stoning, all while it was in the possession of the borrower. That's the point at which the guy came and stole it and slaughtered it. So the borrower, if he were to return it to its owner, would still get value out of it. And the reason is because we're holding like Rabbi Yaakov, who says that the borrower has the right to return a cow, which is a Shar Niskal, even though it's asur b'hana, so it has no value. He could give it back to the owner and say, here's your cow. This is the same cow you gave me. I'm giving it back to you. It became a sharniska along the way, but I fulfill my quality of returning it. However, if he doesn't return it, if he waits until the cow is gone, then he has to return a different cow because he borrowed a cow. He has to give back a cow. So this is the situation here. So when the person stole it, this cow still had value to the owner. It had value to the person he stole it from, which is the borrower, because the borrower could return it and fulfill his obligation to repay. If he doesn't return it, then he has to pay more. So he holds like Rabbi Yaakov, who says that he could return it, and he also holds like Rabbi Shimon, who says that if he doesn't return it because he has to pay a different one, it therefore has a monetary value to him, even though he can't do anything with it. He can't sell it or use it. It has a monetary value to him because it gets him out of having to pay a different cow. That counts as financial value. Therefore, it's worth something, and when the person steals it from him, he's stealing something of value. He's stealing monetary value, and therefore he has to pay 4 and 5 times as much. The Gemara now takes a step back to talk about the discussion that got us into this in the first place. We're going to offer an alternative to that. That discussion had been, what exactly is the opinion of Rabbi Meir about kamli b'derabimine when there is misa, when there's a death penalty involved? We know that Rabbi Meir holds that even if a person is getting malchus, he could still have to pay for something that he did at the same time in the same action because it's two different isurim. The question had been, if somebody gets misa, does he have to pay for a monetary fine that was incurred at the same time? So the Gemara had tried to prove from the fact that in this case of somebody who stole and slaughtered the ox, because we see there that Rabbi Meir holds that he has to pay, that there's no kamli b'damine even by misa. Now the Gemara wants to say no. Rabbi Meir really generally holds that there is even that by misa there is kamli b'damine and he does not have to pay. How come here he has to pay? So the Gemara says the reason here is because there's a chiddush. These are all knas. Knas is a special thing which is an exception. It's not a payment for damages, it's a punitive fine, and that's a special chiddush that the Torah is machadesh, and therefore Rabbi Meir holds that even though he gets misa, he has to pay for that anyway. Now the Gemara says I'm going to show this in a series of statements that was said by Rabbah. Rabbah says if somebody steals a goat on a Wednesday, let's say, and then he goes and he shechts it on Shabbos. So what happened? So he had to repay the damages the one time on Wednesday. That didn't happen on Shabbos. The only thing that takes place on Shabbos is the knas, the 4 and the 5, the extra third and fourth time. So here we're talking about a goat, so it's only 4 times, so it's the extra 3 times that he has to pay for the fact that he shechted it now on Shabbos. So what's the halacha there? So the Gemara says, well, the one time he has to pay because there's no kamei b'derabimine on the damages because it happened on a weekday. The extra 3 times that he has to pay because kamei b'derabimine doesn't apply to knas. Knas is a chiddush, like we're trying to say now. Knas is a chiddush, and because it's a chiddush, it does not apply. There is no exception of kamei b'derabimine, so he has to pay that also. When do we say that there will be kamei b'derabimine? So he says that's if he stole the goat on Shabbos and he does the shechita on Shabbos. Why? Why is there a kamei b'derabimine now? So he doesn't have to pay damages. The damages is not a knas. The fact that he stole it, doesn't have to return it because he stole it on Shabbos and he's getting misa. Now, because he's getting misa, he doesn't have to pay for returning it. Kamei b'derabimine gets him out of that. He would have to pay knas, but since there's no damage that he has to pay, he doesn't have to return it at all. He can't pay knas because the entire knas is paying 3 times as much, an additional 3 times as much, which is a total of 4 times as much of how much he has to return. He doesn't have to return anything, so there's nothing to speak about, there's nothing to steal. Now, there we have our proof that knas is a chiddush, and therefore you can't learn what Rabbi Meir holds generally about kamei b'derabimine when there's misa from a case of knas. Now, the Gemara says that Rabbah says the exact same halacha in a case where somebody didn't steal anything to do with Shabbos, but he did his shechita in a case of bobe machteres, where somebody comes and he digs his way, he breaks into someone's house in the middle of the night. There, the rule is that he's a bar misa. The person can find him, and the person can kill him, because we assume that if he's breaking into someone's house, he's ready to kill the guy, because the guy is going to defend himself, he's going to fight back, he's going to need to kill the guy, and therefore he's a roidef, and that person's allowed to kill him. So if he steals the animal and he shechted while he's still in the machteres, he's still broken into the guy's house, he's a bar misa at that moment. He could be killed for what he's doing. Therefore, he doesn't have to pay for the stealing. If, however, he takes it home and then he takes it back into machteres, that is, he breaks in again, he brings it and then he shechts it now. So even though he's been machteres now, that's not going to get him out of anything because he already had to pay the original returning of the stolen when he took it home. At that moment, there was no way to get out of it because he was not b'machteres anymore. Now he went back into machteres. Okay, it's not going to get him out of that because it's not kamei b'ramene. It's two different actions. It's two different times. He's chayav misa now, but he was already owing the money from before. Now he shechted it here b'machteres, so he should theoretically get out of the knas, the third and the fourth, the 3 and 4 times because he's been machteres and therefore he's mischayev benafsho, but he's not going to get out of it because it's a knas and you don't get out of knas. Now, if however he did it while he was vir, then he would because he doesn't have to pay the initial payment and knas doesn't exist when there's no initial payment at all. Says Gemara, why do I need these two cases? The case of both Chil Shabbos and the case of Machteres, both are mischayev benafsho. What's the extra chiddush? Gemara says there is a chiddush in both of them. The chiddush of machteres is that it's not a full-fledged chiyuv benafsho. It's only chiyuv benafsho while he's there. Chil Shabbos, even he can get misa for at any time. Machteres he can only get while he's been machteres. You may have think that's a weaker Chil Shabbos and therefore there's no kamei b'ramene on that. In the case where it's all done together, that's a kamashman that it is. There's a chiddush in Shabbos also because machteres there's no warning. You don't have to warn the guy. You can just kill him on the spot. Shabbos there is a hasra and therefore you got to warn him, and there would potentially be something more lenient there. So the Gemara says that it's not. Now the Gemara now brings a similar statement that was made by Rav Papa. Rav Papa talks about a cow, not a goat, a cow, and his statement is. The first part is very similar. He says if you stole the cow on a weekday and then he shechted it on Shabbos, so then he's chayev because the original payment he has to do because it was during a weekday, there's no kamei b'ramene on that, and the knas he has to because there's no kamei b'ramene on knas. Now he then adds that if somebody borrowed a cow and he slaughters it on Shabbos, he's pater. Now generally, if somebody slaughters something that he borrowed, he has to pay twice. He has to pay kefel, once to return it and once as a fine. Punitive. Here, he would not, because since he did it on Shabbos, he doesn't have the original repayment, and he doesn't have kanas either, because 2 times 0 is still 0. So the Gemara asks, what is Rav Papa's chiddush over Rabbah? Was he coming to add that the same thing applies to a cow? Was Rabbah talked about a goat? He talks about a cow. What's the difference? So the Gemara says no. Chiddush of Rav Papa is that even in the case where he borrowed it, there's kamei b'ramene. And the reason for that is that Rav Papa holds that really the obligations of a borrower start from the time of the borrowing. It's not that if something happens later, then he has to pay for that later. The time of the borrowing incurs all the obligations. From the time of the borrowing, he has to start feeding the cow. He has to take care of it fully. From the time that he does a kinyan she'ela, that is, where he pulls it towards him. So Gemara says, you may think that his obligation to pay was incurred from the time that he borrowed it, and if the cow dies, in this case, he's the one who killed the cow, so the fact that he has to pay doesn't start then. It starts before. It started at the time that he borrowed it. That being the case, there'd be no kamei b'ramene to get you out of this. Because the time that he slaughtered it, even though it was Shabbos, and he's chayiv skila for that, that doesn't help you get out of the payment, which existed way back from the time you borrowed the cow. It says you may have thought that that's the truth, and therefore, if Papa's coming to tell you that that's not true. The obligation to pay monetarily only comes from when you destroy the cow. Otherwise, the cow belongs to the owner, and you're just going to give it back to him. It's only when it gets destroyed, that's when you now have a financial payment that you have to do. That started now. It did not start earlier. The Gemara now quotes a 3-part statement of Rava, and the Gemara wants to know, does this agree with Rav Papa's statement or not? So there is 2 parts that Rava says, and then a third, and we're not sure which one it's referring to. He's talking about a man who died, and he left as an inheritance to his sons a borrowed cow. Now those sons did not necessarily know that the cow was borrowed. So if they knew, so they can use the borrowed cow until the period of borrowing is up. No problem. If an onus happens, they don't have to pay for the onus. Generally, a borrower has to pay for an onus. They don't, because they're not the borrower. They're allowed to use the borrowing, but they don't have to pay for an onus, and that happens. Now, if they didn't know that this cow was borrowed, and they slaughtered it and they ate it, so they don't have to pay like a borrower who steals and slaughters a cow. Generally, if somebody borrows a cow and then he decides to use it for himself, he has to pay kefel. These guys didn't know it was borrowed, so they don't have to pay kefel. They don't even have to pay a high price. They have to pay the minimum value of the meat. They take the meat and they pay it in the cheapest way because, again, they didn't know that it was borrowed. They do have to return the cow, but they're not responsible for the fact that they were not aware what happened. Now comes the third line. The question is this referring to the first halacha, that they don't have to pay for onsin, or the second halacha, that they can pay cheaply for the meat? The third halacha is that if he left them property, real estate, that was meshubed, that there was a lien on that to pay back his obligations, then, says Rava, they do have to pay. So says the Gemara, what's it referring to? If it's referring to the fact that it was onsin, if it's referring to an onus that happened to the borrowed cow, and this last line is saying that if there was real property, that it had a lien on it, that was meshubed to pay back the borrowed cow, so then they need to pay. If that's what Rava was saying with this last line, then certainly it's true in the Seifa. If it's true for paying for onsin, then certainly it's true that it's also true that they need to pay full value for the fact that they slaughtered the cow. Now, the logic here is that if there is meshubed land, that's already locked in to pay back the debt. And therefore, even if something happens, as an onus or something, that land is as if it already belongs to the person who they owe the cow to. So he gets to collect from that land the full amount. That would be disagreeing with Rav Papa, because Rav Papa said that they don't have to pay anything until there is no obligation to pay until the onus happens. Rava here seems to be saying the land's locked in to pay it already. That means that there already is an obligation to pay, even from the time that the borrowing occurred. Now, if it's going on the last line on repaying that which they ate, so that it's not going on the first part, and it's not saying anything about onsin, it's not saying that it's meshubed, and it's nothing to do with Rav Papa. You cannot necessarily say that he agrees or disagrees with Rav Papa. If he's not saying that they owe, then it would be agreeing with Rav Papa that they don't owe the payment for the onus. The Gemara now steps way back to a previous conversation we had, which was a steer between our Mishnah and a Brisa, and we'd given three answers, and the Gemara now wants to compare the answer of Rav Yochanan and the answer of Rish Lakish and why they didn't say like each other. So the question had been that our Mishnah had said that if a person rapes a woman and he therefore is obligated to pay knas, while at the same time that Maisa carries Malkus, so our Mishnah had said he needs to pay the fine, which implies that he doesn't get the Malkus, and we have a Mishnah in Makis that said that he gets Malkus, which implies he doesn't have to pay the fine. So that was a contradiction. We'd seen that Rav Yochanan had said that generally you need to get Malkus. Our Mishnah is referring to where he wasn't warned, so he can't get Malkus, that's why he has to pay the fine. Rish Lakish had said that our Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, who says that you get both Malkus and the fine. Now, why did they not say like each other? So the Gemara says that Rabbi Yechon didn't want to say like Rish Lakish because he didn't want to make it the opinion of Rabbi Meir. He wanted it to be like the Rabbanan, which of course is la halacha. The Rish Lakish, why did not say like Rabbi Yechonon? So the Gemara says that Rish Lakish didn't want to say that the Mishnah is referring to where he wasn't warned, because Rish Lakish holds that even if he wasn't warned, still there is kamei b'deramine, and he doesn't have to pay the fine, even though he's not actually getting malchus. Because he was due to get malchus, had he been warned, he doesn't have to pay the fine. The Gemara says this is a general machlokes of Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Anytime somebody should be getting malchus because he did something, does that pater him from having to pay a fine, even if he never actually gets the malchus because he wasn't warned? There, Rish Lakish says yes, and Rav Yochanan says does not pater him unless he actually gets the malchus. The Gemara will analyze this machlokes more in depth on the next step.